Hey everyone, welcome back to Navigating in Balance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. I'm your host, Benjamin Butler, and I'm really excited for today's episode. It has been a long time coming. With us today, we have a couple guests. Two of them have been some longtime contributors to the show. I'd like to welcome back Martin Brown and Carlos Ricaurte to this podcast, as well as let our third guest introduce herself. So without further ado, go ahead and take it away.
Hello, my name is Lexi Bishop, and I am a senior at FIU and a junior analyst for the Security Research Hub at the Jack D. Gordon Institute.
Awesome, Lexi. It's great to have you. And honestly, this topic is one that I know internally with a couple people that I work with. I've had this conversation about. We've kind of floated this idea around a couple times. So when I heard that Lexi had done some research on this topic, I was super intrigued. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about China's global space strategy and specifically some of their activities in Latin America, which has emerged as kind of a key geographic and political target for China, specifically with its space program. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about their industrial strategy and other things as well, but by and large, it goes beyond that. It goes into a lot more specifically depth within space as well. So we're going to be looking at China's growing ambitions, infrastructure footprint in the region, including things like the deep space tracking facilities, which we'll get into, satellite partnerships, kind of dual use observatories, things like that. So these sorts of things are really highlighting China's strategy when it comes to space, integrating space infrastructure into kind of their broader geopolitical objectives. And it raises some questions that I think we'll talk about and hopefully can shed a little bit of light on. So taking it from there, I wanted to start off kind of high level. Lexi, could you introduce the overall topic of your research a little bit and give us a bit of a brief intro on what it is that you've been studying?
So basically, I've been looking at all the open source information about Espacio Lejano, a deep space station by the PRC in Argentina. It's one out of four PRC space stations in Argentina, and it's received notable attention for a number of reasons. I look at the military applications of the dual use technology at the site and how it could be used for multi domain precision warfare by the PRC.
Gotcha. No, that's interesting because I think that's exactly the direction that I wanted to take this podcast today. So, you said dual use, right? It has potential to be used by the military as well as by whatever research arm or research program it's being ostensibly run by, right? What is the concern specifically behind why it's known as a dual use facility?
The concern is because, well, for a number of reasons. There's an unclear contract that allows for the PLA to operate at the facility. So that gives you the legal framework to have the military at the site. And then there's the actual dual use technology at the site, which could be used for space or academic purposes, but also there are military applications as well. And when you have limited oversight by the country, facilitated by this unclear contract, then a bunch of concerns have arisen at this site.
Wow. Okay. Um, Martin, Carlos, I know you guys have spent some time researching this topic as well. What are some other background pieces of information that are helpful to know when we're looking at things like this?
Well, as Lexi mentioned, Espacio Lejano, specifically Deep Space Ground Station, plays a pivotal role in China's ambition to become a great space power, right? As it really involves their ambition of developing a deep space network, that being a global array of large radio dishes and ground stations. And all of these ground stations, they to have enhanced telemetry tracking and command capabilities, or TT&C capabilities, reliable communications with satellites and space probes, greater precision in space and satellite navigation, and support for both lunar and planetary exploration. Espacio Lejano overall is a critical temporal coverage on the other side of the globe, enhancing its abilities to maintain frequent communication with space assets, particularly in deep space, where passes are very infrequent due to the long orbitable periods. Yeah.
This also represents kind of like an encroachment into like a competitive region that is Patagonia when it comes to science and development, right? There's already like European Space Agency and NASA sites in that region as well for similar purposes, but never before have we seen like such a large Chinese station being a direct threat to all these other sites, right? We have sites like the Pierre-Giraud Observatory and several NASA telescopes and stuff like that that come with direct, cooperation between ECONOI, which is the Argentine Space Agency, and NASA, right? So what we're seeing right now is simply Espacio Lejano and all these other subsidiary stations essentially becoming a direct, threat to like this already established science and technology sites that we have in Patagonia.
Gotcha. Lexi, so, there's some other space facilities in the region. Europe has some facilities. The US has some partnerships. What, other than some of the dual use capabilities that you spoke to regarding China's facility, how is that different? How has China's approach been different than Europe or the United States when it comes to partnerships with Latin America, specifically when we're talking about space?
I'd say that these deals that China enters into with Latin American countries, most of them typically involve a one-sided, it typically benefits China more than the host country. The contracts usually stipulate jurisdiction over the land for many years. With Espacio Lejano, it's for 50 years, and there's tax exemptions, duty exemptions as well. And there's also typically the stipulation for China to have their own people to run these facilities. So the United States and European nations, they don't do that. They typically involve training for both sides, and China does provide training for, say, Argentina when they have these deals. However, it's not to the same degree. It's typically a one-sided deal when you look at all of the factors.
So that sounds pretty similar in terms of execution as what we've seen from China in some of its other dealings in Latin America, just with industry. We were talking about, for example, the Port of Chancay in Peru several episodes ago, and how essentially you could make the argument, okay, it's good for Peru in a sense, but when you take like a look beneath the surface, it really is a way for China to move material out of the country. And, because they own such a big stake in the mines, it's like, okay, that you just got to dig beneath the surface a little bit. So in that same vein, based on the technical, let's get into the technical capabilities of this site a little bit. Based on the technical capabilities that this site has, infrastructure, etc., what kinds, in theory, of space or military operations could be supported?
Okay, so I would say that there's probably a two-layered approach here. You can look at the physical ground station. You can look at the 114-foot antenna, or 35 meters, whichever way you want to say it. They can track tens of thousands of satellites in Earth's orbit. That increases the PLA's Space Situational Awareness, or SSA. They also have bandwidth such as the X-band. It can be intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as well as command and control. The S-band can serve as airborne early warning systems, typically detecting threats at large ranges. And the K-bands can serve as close-range targeting radars on military aircraft. So that's the ground station itself. But you should also keep in mind that in 2022, Argentina signed a memorandum of understanding with the PRC to use Beidou, which is China's satellite navigation system. And with the satellites, Argentina and China, that space station, can utilize Beidou without needing any of the US's GPS capabilities, and it can enhance the already military capabilities that they have. And they can do so without any oversight from the US or any other countries.
Lexi, just to add on, because you had some really great points regarding Beidou, but also what Espacio Lejano does and what they've been known to do The station, as I mentioned earlier, provides continuous TT&C coverage, especially during important long-duration and interplanetary missions, such as the Chang'e 4 mission to the far side of the moon in 2019, which relied on Espacio Lejano for telemetry and communication. But according to CSIS, the Neuquén station enables China to also track foreign satellites, not just its own, collect space situational awareness data, and potentially support counter space operations. Additionally, CSIS and U.S. Southern Command and other regional experts warn that the space station could be used to spy on U.S. and allied assets, gain intelligence on regional space and defense infrastructure, and facilitate China's broader goal of undermining U.S. leadership in Latin America. Because it enables real-time tracking and control of Chinese satellites as they pass over the southern hemisphere, which they could use to upload new mission commands and download data.
All these agreements, specifically Article 3 of the bilateral agreements, it specifically states that the Argentine government cannot interfere or interpose with things going on at the station, which means that even if someone like Javier Milei wanted to run auditing or wanted to, actually interfere, it would have to go through so many different legal loopholes in order to do so, which makes it so difficult to actually stop the dual use purposes of the station.
And just to
That's
add on,
weird.
sorry,
No, keep going. That I was gonna say that's fishy. Something's not right about that. Keep going,
yeah.
Martin.
No, but also to backtrack a little bit, the facility is operated by the China Satellite Launch and Tracking Control General, and this is a unit belonging to the PLA's General Armaments Department. It's responsible for telemetry tracking command of various Chinese space missions, and despite its nominal classification as a civilian entity, it's formally under the now defunct Commission for Space Technology and Industry for National Defense, which through multiple sources affirm that CLTC functions as subordinate to organize the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force. And their leadership has been historically known to be high-ranking PLA officials, with many serving as on the board of CLTC and in active military roles. So that just adds on to the implications that this satellite base, although adjacent to PLA, is directly supporting PLA activity through the PLA SSF.
So what we see here is a leader, like the leadership entity that's in charge of this site is not only directly linked to the PLA, but is subordinate ultimately to the PLA in a way. That's my understanding, right?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So kind of taking a step back then, are there exercises going on then on a broader sense between the PRC's military and Argentina's military, or is this kind of like a bait and switch? Is it how did Argentina, what was the incentive for them to allow China this facility?
So I can answer that one. In 2014, the contract for establishing this facility was signed in the Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner administration, and this was a part of joining the Belt and Road Initiative. So it was largely an economic incentive for joining and creating this station. At the time, this is during high inflation in Argentina and a large debt. So economically, that's why they entered, and this was just a part of one of the many stipulations of entering BRI. That's what I have to say on that.
Interesting.
Yeah, to further build up on that, the domestic situation within Argentina really depends on how this gets forward. Like Alexi mentioned, the Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner administration, very radically pro-PRC administration, known for making BRI, known for working alongside the PRC in major trade and investment deals, and known for keeping this whole South-South cooperation rhetoric, which once again is the kind of the hypocrisy that we've talked about in previous episodes of letting companies do whatever they want as long as they're not Western companies, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's also interesting because correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that administration later dealt with a pretty significant corruption scandal.
Corruption was one of the main reasons she was
Yeah.
put to trial multiple times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I was like, yeah, I know that name's familiar, and I remember that story coming out. I don't remember what year that was, 2018, 2019. Sure, maybe it was later than that, but that's interesting. So now we have a Chinese space station operating on Argentinian soil. Argentina has very little control over the activities that go on inside of that ground station. They've signed away this land.
But just like in Argentina, in Chile, there's a lot of limited Chilean access and oversight to the actual facility, right? Chile's North Catholic University, which is the local partner that China is using, has revealed that Chilean scientists would only have access to the observatory for just 2 nights a month, with evidence suggesting even this might be reduced to one night, but it's at China's discretion. And UCN also indicated that they have limited knowledge of the specific equipment to be installed for the research objectives. So this could be another dual use heavily in the military application side because they just don't know what China is bringing over.
Wow. Sounds like there's been a trend of we're going to do these things, keep you guys out of it. Back to what I was saying there. I think it speaks to the broader trend that we see of China coming in. They're building their infrastructure, they're establishing these facilities, they're signing these agreements, and then they're freezing out local scientists and local governments and administrations that are, should probably have a hand in things, but for whatever reason, they don't. China's able to do what they want. Question for you, Lexi. I wanted to go back to something. You mentioned that Argentina has access to, I believe it was Beidou, right?
Yes.
I would be curious to know, like, just in civil society, do you know, are there any available statistics or information on like people using GPS versus Beidou in terms of navigation? Has Beidou become the predominant navigational tool like used by people, or is that more so on the high level?
Oh, China is pushing Beidou to be used with different countries, and certain countries have signed on to use it. Argentina's one, and for reference, Beidou surpassed our GPS in certain capabilities, such as an SMS feature, which allows short messaging system, I should say. It has the ability to communicate with the users. So it is specifically designed for people to use, and they're putting it into their own technology and pushing that. They also surpassed our own position navigation and timing feature. And the Department of the Air Force's think tank actually did a great study comparing our own GPS and Beidou. Americans don't typically use Beidou, we all use GPS, but abroad, Beidou is gaining some traction, I'd say.
I was in Argentina a little while ago. I would say that going down there felt like kind of like a Samsung iPhone debate amongst the Argentine crowd. Where like, you have a Samsung. Oh, you use Baidu or you use GPS. But there's no real like tension. It's just kind of what you prefer more at this point. But Baidu is gaining traction.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I had to do a little bit of research sometime back on some different global navigational systems, like satellite based. I know Russia has the GLONASS system as well, and there was a big movement for a while of like, hey, to punish Russia in the war, we should start designing chipsets for all of our navigation devices that don't even have firmware to support GLONASS or anything like that. But I haven't been as closely following Beidou, so that's interesting to know. So let's look at some long time kind of PRC allied nations like Venezuela, right? They were able to launch a satellite a couple years back, and that was directly supported by China. That was essentially China providing some training, providing some oversight, helping them build and launch this satellite. Do you view this as more of a show of power for China in terms of this regard with the satellite launches and things like that, or do you think it actually has some kind of persistent monitoring or like backdoor capability that enables them to, is it like an espionage thing, I guess is what I'm trying to say?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be one thing or the other. It could be both a showing of soft technological power, of showing the United States, yeah, I can do the same thing you do. Not really, because fun fact, the Venesat 1, it only lasted 12 years, despite that it was last for 15, and it's already been shot down because of all technical difficulties. However, regardless, it was supposed to show that kind of soft power of being able to supply the telecommunications the connectivity, the Wi-Fi, like all these other things that these PRC nations need to have. At the same time, due to the fact that they're entirely reliant on Chinese hardware and software, it still means that they can be used for dual use and they can be used for like this espionage type of operations or functions, right? So it's not just one thing or the other. It really depends on the specific nation or the specific satellite.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that was kind of just an aside, but that makes sense. I guess I shouldn't be surprised by that at all. Going back a little bit too, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping around a bit, but I wanted to kind of make sure I kind of maintain some sort of flow here. But um, with the Argentine government and the obviously the current administration under Javier Milei being radically different than the Kirchner government that came before. How is Argentina positioning this partnership with China right now, specifically with the Neuquén facility? And how have like domestic and international observers responded to this like lack of transparency about the site's operations?
Well, Malay early on was very against China, very against working with them. But after coming to office and realizing, you know, darn, we're a lot closer to China than we can actually move away from because China is, as we mentioned in other episodes, right? A lot of times it's not that these Latin American countries have a choice in who they can get investment from. It's who can send them the money, who's willing to send them the money. And in this case, right, with a lot of the economic, especially stuff, it's been China, right, all over Latin America. And so Malay is not, I don't think, going to shut down Neuquén. I think that he has other things to worry about, like China shutting down trade with Argentina. So it puts him in a strict bind for now in the ownership and the usage of the facility. I know, was it Macri? Not Fernandez, but I know Macri was against Neuquén. But this recent administration has been quiet about it just because of the ties they have with China economically. I think they're in a bind for actually shutting down or doing anything about it.
I'd have to completely agree, and Malay is taking a more pragmatic approach considering that China remains one of Argentina's top trading partners, so economically they're stuck. But I do have to say that Malay has made some strides because in March of 2024, I'm sorry, I believe it was April of 2024, when former United States Southern Command Commander General Laura Richardson inspected the facility. And Malay was crucial in that even happening. And that was because all of the international observers, academics, journalists, they were raising questions as to the concerns that we've been talking about. So even though that inspection was only a 5-hour ceremonial tour in which General Richardson was escorted by the Chinese embassy, she was still able to visit the site, and that has been the first unprecedented move in the right direction towards transparency at Espacio Lejano.
But even before her, just to add to what Lexi's saying, that Southcom and commanders at U.S. Southern Command have had very strict positions on Special Lejano because Admiral Craig Fowler, who was an ex-commander of Southcom, in 2019 held a testimony to congressional leaders warning that China could be violating the civilian use clause and using the station for military space operations, including monitoring and targeting U.S. assets, and using the base as really just a broader Chinese strategy to expand military influence in the region.
Yeah, because Argentina has very strong regulations against like full-on foreign military assets within their soil, and if you start using this base in dual use, then it falls under that paradigm. Milei has been trying. I agree with like Lexi was saying. With Milei has been trying to curtail, like rightfully so, Chinese influence both in the broader economy and in the station. He was even extremely critical of it during the campaign season and obviously the first 100 days of the administration. He even promised to launch a full-on audit, as which essentially the Argentine government would like go into the station and ensure that every single personnel, every single part of the data, and everything is only being used according to a civilian clause, which was added by Macri in 2016. However, it hasn't happened because it's very too difficult to antagonize your main commercial partner, specifically because Article 3 stipulates that any sort of auditing, any sort of interference, any sort of anything has to be told to the PRC in advance. So they can't even do it. They can't even step into the station without telling the Chinese that they're going to do it way in advance.
Which negates the whole point of really why you would even want to be doing the audit. So yeah, you're kind of fighting with both hands tied behind your back. There's only so much you can do. Makes sense. And, coming out of a deep economic recession to you don't want to be the administration that's like, "Okay, yeah, the economy's terrible and it's tanking, but we are auditing this space station." No, they probably, I understand the logic of not necessarily wanting to die on that hill. But okay, taking focus towards the US and US foreign policy for a minute, right? How are we and our allies engaging with sort of our regional partners in the area and providing viable alternatives to these Chinese partnerships? And what do you think are some actions additionally that could be taken to strengthen the transparency and sort of democratic alignment in our space cooperations there?
Well, the U.S. and its allies are working with a lot of bilateral space agreements in Latin America, like the Artemis Accords, but really to build, capacity building in space operations. NASA's been engaging with countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico to support their space programs through non-military and with peaceful research objectives, including satellite launches, space debris management, and Earth observation. The U.S. is also supporting the development of regional collaboration frameworks for space. That can be an act of an alternative to Chinese initiatives, just like the IASN or the Latin American Caribbean Space Agency can be key platforms for shared space infrastructure among Latin American nations. But honestly, I think needs and could help these countries is an interagency mechanism like CFIUS in the U.S., the Committee on Foreign Investment of the United States. It can allow frameworks to be put in place through their governments that just analyze foreign investment coming into the country. The U.S. CFIUS has had a long history of looking at foreign investments. We banned Huawei because of its dual use capabilities. These countries can use their interagency mechanism to look at companies' malpractices through economic engagement, their dual use military engagements that could be a national security threat for their country, right? So, yeah.
I'd like to add on to that. Martin mentioned the Artemis Accords, which obviously there are several Latin American countries that have signed on to US-led agreements promoting responsible behavior in space, transparency, and peaceful exploration. However, there's no enforcement agency. So what Martin's proposing is really smart. Another problem or challenge that the United States faces, however, is that Chinese officials can come over to Latin American countries and talk to them about possible space programs, projects, cooperation, etc. However, for United States officials such as Southcom officials to go over to Latin American countries and propose interagency cooperation or anything of that nature, there's a lot of processes and levels that you have to go through. So China, they can just, snap their fingers, they go right ahead. It's a top-down approach, basically. Whereas the United States, we have processes and procedures. So we kind of lack that autonomy that China has.
Oh,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. Carlos.
Yeah, I guess other potential things we could do is just use multilateral organizations that already exist. The OAS, despite that people don't really listen to it as much in Latin America, is still very active and has been used by the United States before to meet its objectives. So it could be used as a multilateral way to push towards further transparency. There's also the Inter-American Development Bank, which essentially is freely allowed to put stipulations into specific investments into science and technology. You could push through bilateral agreements to be like, okay, if you want this investment, if you want these loans, if you want access to this capital, then you have to provide the means of ensuring that what I'm investing in can actually be transparent, can actually be held accountable both by your government and by mine. So these are just mechanisms that have been used before and that can be used in a way that doesn't feel like it's an obligation to Latin American countries, but at the same time gives us what we need, which is the accountability.
And sorry to add one more thing, and even if it isn't on the government level, you can have private sector engagement as well, such as US companies like SpaceX, Amazon's Cooper, and Planet Labs. They offer launch services, satellite data, and broadband solutions that can compete with what China's offering. So we don't even need to go at the national level, but we need more private sector engagement as well that don't have to go through the same loopholes that US officials have to as well.
Have we seen, just, I know SpaceX does a lot of business with a lot of different people. Have we seen SpaceX make any moves in Latin America or the Caribbean?
I've seen SpaceX, Blue Origin, and OneWeb explore satellite based services, providing really high speed internet and global communication coverage in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah, that I just was wondering out of curiosity because it's to your point, like I think regulatory wise, China's able to do some things that may not be hurdles to them or hurdles to us. And I think too, like with China's philosophy on how companies operate, even if they're a private company in China, ultimately they answer to the PRC, whether directly or indirectly, and they receive a different level of state support than typically a company in the United States would, for example. So I almost wonder. I think that you're onto something with the private approach, which kind of leaves me into my one of my final questions, which is over the next 5 years, right, Lexi? You've spent a lot of time researching. What do you think are going to be some of the most critical factors, both on the Chinese side, like from their perspective and their strategy? What do you expect to see from them? And then what are you what would you advise the US to do as a response?
Okay. Well, I would say that China has a competitive edge in that they offer turnkey solutions. They offer to finance these operations, manufacture, launch, operate the satellites. It's especially appealing to countries with limited space infrastructure, and they might not have the capital to do so, but they feel like they want to modernize and they see space as an opportunity to do so. So, what I think the United States could do, I mentioned the private company alternatives as well, but the United States, such as the United States Southern Command, they are this new I don't know if you'd necessarily say administration, but Admiral Halsey at the Hemispheric Security Conference, he stated that space is a priority and that they're looking at the TT&C capabilities, the dual use technology. So I know that the United States does have this as a priority, but I think that we need to engage more. We need to leverage our bilateral relationship with Argentina and really crack down on making regular inspections if we can do so. I know that the legal contract is really hard to get around, but I'm sure that we can have more engagement in the region, and that will lead to better understanding of the operations that go on at these space facilities.
I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And I think with space being a priority and kind of that being at the forefront of everyone's mind as we kind of move back into a great powers competition, and we are viewing the way that we're portraying China and positioning it is as a peer threat and a pacing threat that we ultimately need to take very seriously. And I think that with that in mind, it will continue to open the door for hopefully things like the inspections, hopefully a closer bilateral conversation really back and forth between the US and Argentina in this case. And hopefully that will proliferate and increase in frequency going forward. But guys, I just want to say thank you. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. That was a little bit crazy, but appreciate your time today and for Lexi, you presenting your research and getting to share a little bit with the audience specifically about something that I think flies under the radar, in a way. I think it's easy to get lost in just kind of the sea of world events that are going on. But I think under the surface, there's some pretty interesting things that I think are threats that people aren't really tracking. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your work. And I would love to have you back on as a guest as well.
Thank you. I'd love to come back.
Yeah, this is great. And Martin, Carlos, thank you as always. And guys, yeah, if you're out there listening to this, watching this, hopefully I can clean this episode up, polish it up a little bit, and make it look a little bit better. Might have to do a little splicing, but we manage and we survive. So, guys, this has been Navigating in Balance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. And if you haven't already, right? Couple big things. I'm going to do the regular subscribe to our YouTube. You should do that, first of all. Subscribe, follow us on LinkedIn. We have our own podcast page, but also please, we have a form. You can access this form on the LinkedIn. We have a post with the link. But if you're interested in being on the show, if you have something you would like to talk about, something interesting in the world of geopolitics, defense, intelligence, anything of that nature, we welcome you on. So please feel free to pass this along to anybody that you know that would be interested in just sitting down and having a brief conversation.